So I recently rewatched. I've watched it 1,000 times, I'm sure. Um, Friday the 13th, Jason Takes Manhattan. Now, for those of you who are unfamiliar with the movie, shame on you. But for those of you who are unfamiliar with the movie, it is the eighth film in the Friday the 13th franchise. Um, the last film produced by Paramount Pictures, and from there it would go on to New Line Cinemas, and New Line would make several different movies as well. But I think a lot of people will watch Jason Takes Manhattan and be generally disappointed in the film as is. And it's understandable. I mean, frankly, the film, as I play it with the camera a little bit to make it look a little less stupid, um, in my frame of view, the film itself is not a great film in any way, shape, or form. There's a lot going on with it as to what you could say is the cause for the problem for this movie not being good. Uh, the idea of taking Jason out of the woods and putting him in New York City is not a horrible idea in of itself. There's a lot of potential interest and potential fun and potential um, new situations you could put the character in and put other characters in by dropping him into New York City. So the idea that taking him out of the woods and putting him in New York City is not such a bad idea. I think most people will have the complaint that the biggest issue the movie has is it's literally called Jason Takes Manhattan. So you would assume Jason is going to be in Manhattan for this whole movie, or at least most of the movie, or a good portion of the film. And the truth of the matter is he's really not. He's in the movie in Manhattan maybe 15, 20 minutes towards the end of the movie. The bulk of this film takes place on a ship as a group of students are traveling from wherever their high school is, I assume the Crystal Lake area, to get to New York City. Now, by the way, I'd also like to point out that this cruise ship is possibly the worst cruise ship you have ever seen in your life. It's a freighter. It's a freight ship, which apparently had a few cabins on it, and they squeezed in a little dance floor kind of situation and a few other things to make it look less like a shitty freighter. But it is a pretty shitty freighter. Now, I'm a little more forgiving than most people are when it comes to a bad film, and even more forgiving when it comes to this film. I've read a lot of the backstory on it. I read the Crystal Lake Memories, so I understand that part of the problem this film suffers from was Paramount Pictures not wanting to pony up a fair amount of money to make it a decent film. Now, don't get me wrong. I will squarely lay some blame on the director as well. Clearly you could have, or maybe came up with something a little bit better than what you did. The writers, the directors, everybody involved in that probably could have came up with something a little bit better. But the problem is they were sold on the idea with taking Jason out of the woods, which would be something new, and putting him in Manhattan. And when Paramount Pictures agreed to that, you kind of are assigned to certain things that you're going to need to do, which is actually have the film be in Manhattan. That being said, Paramount Pictures was not willing to dole out the amount of money needed to do the scenes that were needed for the film. So, whereas if you had written a film where the bulk of it was in New York City and Paramount cut your budget, all of a sudden you've got this much you can film in New York City, and then you've got to pad out the rest of the film with other scenario, which is, of course, this cruise ship. Now, as I said, the cruise ship is a terrible cruise ship. It doesn't look anything like a cruise ship. I mean, I've been on some cut rate cruises like around just the New York Harbor, and they look 1,000 times better than this cruise ship did, for sure. Now, I actually can't crap on the cruise ship parts. They're not bad. I think the special effects suffer a little bit, probably again from the budget cuts from Paramount. But I also think they told a pretty good story in a pretty weird and creepy situation. A creepy, weird place for it to be. I mean, on board this ship had a lot of interesting places and things to do there. It was certainly different. Jason on the water as opposed to Jason on the land certainly had its own little groove going there. So I can't really bitch and complain about that very much. It actually works. Actually, I feel personally it's the better part of the film, mainly because they're not trying so hard to make it work, make something work that wouldn't work. And that's what the other problem with this film is being that it's supposed to be in New York, and we only have X amount of time, X amount of sets, X amount of points where they could be in New York. They did a lot of redressing of places that were not New York to make it just feel like a grimy city. And as I understand, most of it was Canada, which of course is where a lot of films are made because it's cheaper to make films. So they end up putting a lot of stand-in for New York City in what is there. The only actual scenes filmed in New York City is there's some long view shots of the city itself and of the Statue of Liberty. And the only actual scene where we have any cast members actually in New York, is a small scene in Times Square because it's one of the most recognizable places in the world. So, you do feel a little gypped on those situations. And we're going to address the elephant in the room. The end of the story ends up being that Jason gets turned into a little boy again because they're in the sewers. He's chasing him around the sewers, and supposedly every midnight the sewer gets flushed with toxic waste. The sewer gets flushed with toxic waste, and it turns Jason into a boy. Suspending disbelief is something you need to do on almost any Friday the 13th film. And you even need to do it even more with each successive film. Whereas 1 might be plausible and 2 might even be a little bit plausible, but a little less plausible. 3 is a little less plausible than that. By the time you get to 6, you've really got to suspend disbelief. But they're still fun films. 6, 7, 8, they're all still fun films. I can't fault most of these films, and I might do reviews of them at some point in time. But I think Jason Takes Manhattan is probably the one where people will infamously bitch about the most. So that's why I'm taking that one and doing it here. At least of the Paramount version, the Paramount owning of the franchise. So, the fact that we're supposed to believe that toxic waste will turn a person into a child again, or the fact that we're supposed to believe that New York City would actually just flush the sewers with toxic waste every midnight, it is a little beyond the pale of suspension of disbelief, at least in my opinion. I think a lot of people will feel that way. But in watching it this time, I noticed something that was a little weird and a little caught my eye in terms of differences from what I had previously kind of perceived parts of the film as. There's any number of scenes where our lead actress is, the backstory on her is as a child, her uncle had pushed her in the lake, told her, you need to learn how to swim, or Jason, who's drowned in that lake, is going to get you. And supposedly Jason dragged her under, and, it kind of traumatized her. Now, that being said, we are never 100% sure whether Jason actually dragged her under the lake, or whether this is just a traumatic experience, and her panicking and caused, things of that nature had caused her to imagine that that's what happened. And it does make some perfect sense that would be the case. I mean, her uncle just told her this story, and she panicked, and maybe that's what she thought she saw. Or maybe we are trying to go with the concept that Jason did pull her under as a child. Whatever the deal is, it is what it is. The timelines don't exactly match up, mainly because there's a lot of slipshotty continuity between films. But that being said, the suspension of disbelief again, which is a big key in a lot of these Friday the 13th films. But that whole scenario of her and the little boy Jason started to play out in my head of what we were seeing and what we weren't seeing. Because as a teenager on this cruise ship to New York City, she's still having some of these little flashback sequences. And she has one in her cabin where the little boy comes through the porthole and is like reaching at her, or maybe it was the mirror, but I think it was the porthole. But at any rate, he's reaching out at her. Now, the thing that kills me on this is in every sequence where she has these little visions or memories or flashbacks of her own, she is the only character that sees this little boy. Except for the one in the stateroom. In the stateroom, it happens, and the dog reacts to it and runs out of the room. Which makes me wonder, like, what the hell? Was this actually something happening? I mean, why would the dog react to this? I mean, if this was just flashbacks in her head, why would the dog react to this? It doesn't make too much sense to me. And that's the thing that actually bothers me the most about this movie, is why did the dog react to that? Now, there's always the argument that maybe the dog wasn't necessarily reacting to that, but maybe reacting to her freaking out over it. And frankly, it's not really played that way, but I could trying to find a logical link as to why this would happen. Now, that being said, something new occurred to me, which has never occurred to me before while watching Jason Takes Manhattan. Let's take the assumption that her seeing this boy Jason is all in her head. And she is the only character that actually sees this. We'll disregard the dog thing, or we will take that excuse that the dog was reacting to her, not reacting to the actual little boy thing. And that wasn't real. It was just her delusional breakdown for a moment or two. So it occurs to me that when we see the toxic waste come in and change Jason into a boy at the end of the film, that maybe nobody else is seeing that. Maybe nobody else, because there's only one other character there. It's the guy in the film that's her somewhat love interest. And he doesn't really react to this. He doesn't show any. There's no moment where afterwards, where after this happens, where he turns to her and goes, "Well, that was fucking weird, man. He turned into a little boy. What the hell was that about?" We don't really have any situation like that. There's no moment in the film where anyone else acknowledges the fact that the toxic waste has turned Jason into a little boy again. So it makes me wonder that if, and I don't think I've ever heard this mentioned before, maybe he doesn't get turned into a little boy by the end of that film. Maybe this is all in her head, because she's already having these visions. She's already having these flashbacks, these moments, these delusional states. And also, let's not forget, earlier in the film, she had been kidnapped by a couple of hoodlums who had pumped her full of some narcotic that we are not familiar with. So it's not unreasonable to think that when we see that moment in the film and we all kind of go, "Oh God, the toxic waste turned Jason into a little boy again. How fucking stupid is this?" That in defense of the film itself, maybe that's not what we're supposed to take away from that scene. Maybe what we're supposed to take away from that scene is that it didn't turn him into a little boy again, but this is a delusion she's having, either drug-induced or based on the delusions she has had previously throughout the entire film. Now, I had never considered that for that moment before. It never dawned on me that was the case. I never looked at it like that. And I don't think I've ever heard anyone in any review mention that and ever come up to that point or come to that conclusion. But I think it's a valid thing. I think it kind of flips how you look at the movie. Now, while you could certainly shut on the film saying, it wasn't in New York and it wasn't, you can go over all the things we talked about before. And even other things about the film as well. The kind of shitty practical special effects they were forced to use as opposed to actually being able to go a little bit further into masks or tubing or things like that, or effects that would be a little more expensive to do. It seems like a lot of the special effects seem to be shot as practical effects as opposed to actually putting a little actual post-production effort into it or any pre-production effort to make it look a little more realistic. They went with whatever old-fashioned tricks they could use that were cheap and easy to use. So you can shit on the movie for that. You can shit on the fact that Jason, for whatever reason, is slimy throughout the entire film, which is something that bothers the shit out of me, but I understand that's the look the director wanted for Jason. But looking at the film again in fresh eyes, which aren't that fresh, just maybe repeated reviews or finally making that connection in my head that maybe what we see in that instant of Jason turning into a boy is not what really happens, but what she saw happen or what she thought happened. Much like she thought Jason took her under the water, or much like she thought Jason was in the cabin, or Jason came out of the mirror, or Jason was standing, little boy Jason was standing in the middle of the street. All these things are images that play out for just the main character. So maybe what we saw in that sewer is what plays out for the main character as well, as opposed to we're just taking on faith that he was turned into a little boy, which makes a lot more sense now, and it kind of flips how I thought about the movie. Also, it kind of jives in well with the next film in the series, which is Jason Goes to Hell, which is a whole nother review, to be honest with you. But at the beginning of Jason Goes to Hell, Jason is once again, or is a full-grown adult, or whatever the big version of Jason is. He's no longer a little child like we were left to believe at the end of the last film. And that would actually make more sense now if he was still this same deformed, backwoods, for lack of a better term, retarded, because obviously he clearly had other mental problems, but zombie killing machine. He was full grown is the whole point of it. So, it's just something that struck me, and something that I thought I should include in the review of Friday the 13th, Jason Takes Manhattan. Again, I'm a little softer on the movie than most people are, because I get that there was a lot of struggles. There were other scenes that were planned out for like Jason and Julius in Madison Square Garden, where they had that fight on the rooftop. Would have been in Madison Square Garden. There would have been other things if they could have afforded it, but they couldn't afford it. So they were committed to what they had already, but they decided, since they couldn't afford that, since Paramount Pictures was not going to give them the money, they would just go with what the best they could. So, while Jason Takes Manhattan is clearly not a great film, probably one of the worst Friday the 13th or Jason movies, whichever you want to call it, I consider it one big franchise no matter who was producing the films. But it is probably not the best of any of the series. But that little thought about how that ending plays out might make you see some of the film in a different light. I mean, maybe it won't. Maybe you'll still sit there and go, my God, it fucking sucked. And you could be right. You wouldn't. It's not an invalid point to say the movie fucking sucked. I just thought that making that connection made me see the film in a different light. Maybe it makes you see the film in a little different of a light as well. So, there you go. The Cheese Remote review of Friday the 13th, Jason Takes Manhattan.